Story 1, The Visitor in Cell 17, submitted by Eerie. I was incarcerated at Chiang Mai Women's Prison in Thailand for a crime I'd rather not mention. If you know anything about Thai prisons, you know they're notorious for being packed, and privacy is a luxury. Most of the women there had stories, not just about the crimes that landed them in prison, but also the weird happenings within those aged walls. My first month went by without a hitch. It was the typical prison life, trying to mind my own business and learning the ropes. The cells were lined in a row with metal bars that allowed little to no privacy. But by the time my second month rolled around, they moved me to a different cell because my previous mate got released. I was placed in cell number 17. Cell 17 had an old bunk bed. The metal had chipped paint, and the mattress had seen better days. My new cellmate was Mai, a woman in her late 40s, I guess. She had been there longer than most, and was known to be a bit odd, but harmless. On my first night in cell 17, Mai warned me, "Don't talk to her." I looked at her confused. Talk to who? She pointed at the empty corner of the cell, her eyes wide. The woman comes out at night. I thought she was just trying to mess with the new girl. I laughed it off and told her I wasn't easily scared. But that night, while everyone else slept, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone whispering. I thought it was just Mai, so I whispered back, "What?" Silence. A moment later, I felt something tug at my blanket. I turned thinking it was Mai, but she was sound asleep, facing the wall. The whispering started again, but it wasn't coming from her direction. It was coming from the corner. The next morning, I asked Mai about it. She just looked at me and repeated her warning. "I told you, don't talk to her." For the next few days, the same routine continued. The whispers at night, the gentle tugs on my blanket, and even the feeling of someone sitting at the edge of my bed. It wasn't like anything I had ever experienced. It felt real, tangible, and it was all coming from that same corner. One day, during lunch, I asked another inmate about cell 17. She looked surprised, then whispered, "You didn't know? That cell's haunted. Years ago, a foreigner was locked in there. She couldn't handle the confinement, and she took her own life right in that corner." I felt sick, but I also felt trapped. It's not like I could request a different cell because I was scared of a ghost, so I decided to confront it. That night, I waited, and the whispers started, and I boldly asked, "Who are you?" The room grew cold. There was a long pause before a soft voice replied, "I'm lost." The voice sounded pained and lonely. Despite my initial fear, I felt a pang of sympathy. Every night after that, we'd talk. She'd tell me about her life outside prison, her regrets, her longings to be free. It was like having an invisible friend. One night, she whispered, "Help me leave." Not knowing how to help a spirit, I consulted Mai. She had been in that cell longer than anyone and seemed to know about the spirit. She suggested that we make an offering to set her soul free. We gathered flowers and incense sticks, placing them in the corner of the cell. That night, instead of whispers, there was a soft, melancholic song filling the room. The next morning, the atmosphere felt lighter. There was no sign of our spectral roommate. The rest of my time in that cell was perfect. No whispers, no tugs on the blanket. It felt like the spirit had finally found its way home. Story 2, Behind the Walls of Chiang Mai, submitted by Jericho. I was 22 and I ended up in a Thai prison for a minor charge, something related to a bar brawl. It wasn't my proudest moment, but it happened. I was placed in Chiang Mai women's prison. Now I know it sounds odd, being a guy and all, but back then, some sections of the prison were used for overflow for male inmates. I was unlucky enough to be in that category, so my cell was pretty isolated from the rest. It was situated in one of the older sections where they hadn't kept inmates for years. I remember being told stories about the conditions in the early days of the prison. It was meant to be hell on earth, and those old sections had been some of the worst of it. But stories are stories, and I've always been the kind to take things as they come. A week into my stay, at around 2 a.m, I was awoken by a faint sound echoing down the corridor. It wasn't shouting or screaming. It was the sound of singing. It was soft and eerie, a lullaby, but with an unnerving tone to it. I tried to figure out where it was coming from, but it seemed to echo from every direction. The next day, I casually mentioned it to one of the guards during roll call. He looked at me puzzled and said no one was housed near me, that section was off limits. Maybe rats, he said, laughing, but rats don't sing. Each night after that, the singing started, always at the same time, and every night it seemed to get just a bit louder. The lullaby started to play in my head during the day, and I found myself humming it during my chores. One evening, about 2 weeks in, I decided to investigate. After lights out, I waited for the guards to finish rounds. Sneaking out wasn't as hard as you might think. Security was tighter around the newer sections, and my corner of the prison was relatively overlooked. I followed the voice down a series of dark hallways, the halls damp and moldy, the old tiles peeling off from years of neglect. With only the faint glow from the moonlight filtering in through the barred windows, I finally reached what seemed to be the source of the singing. It was an old sealed-off cell. The bars were rusted, and the door had a heavy lock that looked like it hadn't been opened for decades. Inside, there was nothing but an old, dilapidated wooden bed frame and a small, stained mattress. But as I got closer, I noticed something unsettling. A small, worn-out doll, its eyes glass reflecting the dim light, sitting propped up against a pillow. That's when it hit me. The song wasn't echoing through the halls. It was coming from this very cell, from that doll. I was rooted to the spot. I mean, who wouldn't be? It's not every day you find a singing doll in an old abandoned prison cell. Suddenly, the singing stopped. There was a brief silence, followed by a soft giggle from the doll. I bolted. I ran faster than I ever ran before, the eerie giggles chasing me down the hall. I locked myself in my cell and stayed there, wide-eyed for the rest of the night. The next morning, I begged the guards to move me to a different section, but for some reason, they obliged. Maybe they could see the genuine fear in my eyes. Story 3: The Shadow Behind the Bars. Submitted by Emily. I worked as a prison guard at the Chiang Mai women's prison in Thailand for a couple of years. It's one of those places that has a rich history, being built over a century ago. You can imagine over the years it's seen its share of drama, escape attempts, and confrontations. But there's one night, one memory, that still won't leave me alone. It was around 2:30 a.m., and the prison was bathed in its usual hush of late-night silence. The only sound was the distant hum of the air conditioner and the soft pat-pat of my shoes as I did my rounds. As I was checking every cell, ensuring everyone was accounted for and that there were no unusual activities, I was making my way down one of the older wings, and I noticed a cell with its lights on. Odd, I thought. Most of the inmates knew the drill and respected the rules. They should have turned it off by 10 p.m. My immediate thought was that someone was trying to read or write under the covers. However, as I approached, I didn't hear any rustling or see any sign of activity. When I reached the cell, I found it empty, not just devoid of inmates, but completely void of any personal belongings. It was as if it had been abandoned for years. Now this wasn't a vacant cell. Miss Suda was supposed to be here. I remembered distinctly because she had just been transferred a few days prior. I even recalled having a short conversation with her earlier that evening. Feeling uneasy, I turned off the light and decided to report it immediately. Maybe she had been transferred again. Maybe there had been an administrative mix-up. I was about to walk away when I caught the sight of something that made me freeze in my tracks. The light coming from the adjacent cell cast a shadow on the ground. It was mistakenly a silhouette of a person standing right behind me, but the posture was all wrong. It was too still, too quiet. Without turning, I quickly radioed for backup, trying to keep my voice steady. I inquired about Miss Suda's whereabouts, hoping there would be a logical explanation for her absence. That's when I heard it. A soft, melodic hum. A song I couldn't recognize. The haunting tune seemed to come from right behind me, from the shadow's direction. My heart felt like it was in my throat. I trained for many situations, but not for something inexplicable like this. The humming stopped abruptly, replaced by the faintest whisper. They don't like the lights. The voice was unmistakably Miss Suda's. Just as I was about to turn around and confront the situation, backup arrived. I was met with bewildered looks. "There is no one here," one of the guards said. The cell was still empty, the hallway silent. In the midst of my confusion, another radio call came through. Miss Suda was found in the prison's library, completely unharmed. She claimed she had been there for hours, reading. The cameras unfortunately had a glitch and didn't capture any footage for that time frame. I tried to share my experience, but most of my colleagues laughed it off, blaming it on fatigue or just my imagination playing tricks. But there is one older guard who had been working there for decades, who listened silently. Once everyone had left, he whispered, "It's the old wing. It has memories. Just always turn off the lights."